The Queen movie has it that, I haven't seen it, but what I hear is that, Queen do their piece and the world goes crazy and the phone lines collapse. That's not true.
How are you?
Good, man.
Love seeing you or a version of you in this thing. How do you think they did portraying you in the musical?
He comes on, he's very vulgar and rude, so it's pretty accurate.
What did you make of it when you saw yourself for the first time on stage?
I saw them in, the workshop stage.
Yeah.
And it was very embarrassing for both of us, both the guy playing me and me. And I sort of lurked in the corner, and this guy came out and he said, sure, be Gary, I'm Bob Geldof, I'm from Ireland, sort of thing. I said, no, that doesn't work. So that guy went, and they got in this guy from Liverpool. And bizarrely, when he was 9 years old, his granny used to make him stand on the kitchen table and do impersonations of me.
No way.
So he's grown up to beat me. And I get along really great with him. The accent is quite hard to do, a South Dublin middle class adenoidal monotone. So he got that down pretty much. At this point, you just see it as a character, and you just see it how well he's doing it or not. But the truth is that the story of the play is pretty more or less accurate.
But my understanding was you weren't on board when you were first approached.
Yeah, no, I mean, they came to me. Exactly what happened is Jamie Wilson, the producer, who does a lot of shows on Broadway and West End, young guy, and the writer, John O'Farrell, who I was familiar with from his books and newspaper columns, and the script was really terrible. It was about Bob. It wasn't about, Band Aid, Live Aid. And I just said, absolutely not. And they said 10% of this would go to the trust, the Band Aid Trust. So it's beholden to you to kind of more than go along with this, to sort of say, okay, well, let's look if it's serious, simply on that basis. So I said it's awful. They came back 3 times.
You said what's awful?
The script. And I came back 3 times.
It was bad, was it?
Yeah, it was terrible. It was about me and my life, as opposed to this moment when the world, because of, with all due credit, as I credited last night on the stage in Toronto to CBC and their genius journalist, Brian Stewart, and the BBC and their equally genius journalists. I mean, it's really a story of why journalism is so important, why fact, truth, showing you reality, not some nonsense, and making you see it and then saying, and now what, So when it got to that point, when the script was honed down to what actually happened, then I said, okay, go. But it still has to be fun because it's a great night. You pointed out the music. The music is
really good, yeah.
The music is just the guy who does the arrangements. I mean, I took Pete Townsend to see it, and there's this 17-year-old kid does My Generation, and I can hear the groans all over North America. Don't mess with that song. You don't mess with My Generation. Honestly, Pete just grabbed my knee like that, and he just looked. I could see him thinking, maybe I should revive this because the arrangement works so brilliantly for an entirely new generation, and yet has the same energy, the same, revivifies it, So the arranger was fantastic and reimagined these songs so that you hear them. I know this sounds dreadful, but see it, because even if you just go for the music, it's amazing.
So can we just tell a little bit of the story here? Because I want to get to the CBC part, which I heard about. I watched your speech from last night. I want to talk a little bit about that. And I think people at this point know do they know it's Christmas Story? I didn't know until I watched, and I thought I knew that pretty well, and I didn't know until I watched the musical, The Story of Live Aid, that if I get this right, you were in Ethiopia, and what is the moment that dawns on you where you say this has to be a concert, this has to be bigger than the single?
The real realisation was when Harry Belafonte called me after Band Aid had happened, and I had thought after the record that that's the end of, that's all I want to do. Get to Christmas, me and Midjour, we make £100,000, give it to Oxfam, and that's the most a singer or a songwriter can do. But it became a phenomenon, and certainly I hadn't anticipated that. And of course, the reason why it became a phenomenon was, again, I hadn't thought it through. everyone watched in those days of a sort of binary television universe. Everyone saw the news, especially the BBC News or the CBC News, whatever. Everyone saw that and were revolted and ashamed and, angered by it. But nobody quite had an outlet for that passion. So when the record comes out, they dived on the record and said yes. And this took place around the world, and we had millions of pounds now. And because it was a popular phenomenon, the press said, you've got to go and report what you're doing with the money, or else that we can't keep the story going. So it then becomes incumbent upon you, whether you like it or not, to do that sort of thing. The Americans call up Harry Belafonte, Michael Jackson call me and say, we're going to do it, will you come over? So I do USA for Africa. I don't know if you've seen that film.
I saw your speech in it when you came in.
Yeah, well, I'm mortified, Quincy, which isn't it? Quincy says, pay attention, everyone. And here in front of me is my bedroom wall has come down in front of me, and they're all standing on bleachers like school children.
Bob Dylan's there, yeah.
Ray Charles, Smokey Robinson, Willie Nelson, Paul Simon. Where does it stop, And so I'm there really embarrassed. And Quincy says, everyone please pay attention. You all know Bob Geldof. No. Nobody knows Bob Geldof. So, Pache, the Boomtown Rats, great, but, Willie and Ray and Bob, and,
that became a massive... They did it last night on the Grammys. Did you see that?
I just heard now.
Yeah,
Harvey Goldsmith, who's the producer live in England, he's here with me for the play, and he told me last night. He said Stevie came on and did it. Of course, it's the 40th anniversary of We Are the World, and those two combined then become massive. So now everyone's alert to it. I've been in Africa, and essentially a lot of the things we are doing, we're not getting through this very vivid war zone. And later that year, we had 600 trucks operating through the war and the drought, and we were getting bombed and strafed, and our drivers were being killed. But I was in Port Sudan, and I was saying, why is this stuff not moving? And the aid workers said, because there's a cartel operating here, and they're charging prices that nobody can pay. So there was one trucking company, and they saw this is their moment. So the food was, just lying, the grain was just lying on the docks. So my thought was, well, when the cartel operates, you break the cartel, but how? So the only way was to buy trucks that would truck for free, but we didn't have anything near that sort of money. So if you put the two concerts together, the two records together as a thought, would that work?
The two records together was not enough to break the cartel, not enough to get your own trucks, not enough to... If
you put them together in a concert format. So my initial thought was, well, let's do a Christmas one-off, very like the Beatles did with back in the 60s with All You Need Is Love. It was the first transatlantic link-up when I was a kid in school. And that had a big influence on me, watching that. I thought it was cool. I mean, Norway was on before the Beatles, and now some trout fishing from Norway, and you had some guy trout fishing, and next minute it goes to George Martin, the Beatles producer, in this white engineer's coat, and he says, the Beatles, take one, all you need is love, and it goes in and there's the Beatles, Mick and Eric at their feet, and they do the coolest song, and... it was, and Britain was so confident of itself then. They didn't start with the English national anthem. The Beatles started with the French national anthem. I talk about confidence. So that really struck me, and I think that was sort of the thing. Let's use music. Music at that point had become the lingua franca of the planet. It wasn't English. It was pop music. It had moved out from its Southern American roots to take over the world. So we could talk to each other for the first time through this new stuff called satellites about a common human monstrosity, which was 32 million people about to die of hunger in a world of surplus. That's ridiculous. It's intellectually ridiculous. It's economically absurd, and it is morally repulsive. So we could do something about it.
So I want to spend a little bit of time later just chatting with you a little bit about how now that we have a greater access to information all around the world, and our media landscape has changed so much, how we even feel more fractured, and how satellite helped then, but does the internet really help now? But I want to get a couple of moments from Live Aid before we die. I'll start with a fun one. Can we just play this? I watched that last night. Freddie Mercury
Yeah.
and Queen at Live Aid.
Yeah.
What do you hear when you hear that?
Harry Belafonte, daylight come and we will go. You know, that's what I hear. Harry was a pistol, you know. He was...
That's what you hear. You hear like they're doing a version of Banana Boat song.
Harry Belafonte is the first black guy to have a network TV show because he was so beautiful. But, you know, he was so subtle because he was a Marxist, basically. And he took island slave songs and put them at the top of the American charts. Daylight come and I want to go home. Mr. Tallyman, count my bananas. I'm done. I'm exhausted. Daylight come and I want to go home. You know, #1 charts, you know. So when I hear Freddie do it, that's pop music, but Freddie is lifting Harry, you know.
Were you there for that, Mo? Do you remember the Queen set?
Of course I do, yeah.
What?
What?
I'm dying to know. What do you remember about it?
You know,
It's a very famous set, is what I'm trying to say.
It is one of the great rock performances of all time. I mean, you've got to put it in context. What time of the day were they on? They were on about 6. So they weren't a headliner at that stage, you know. They were sort of... I think their star had risen and fallen, is the truth. I was asked to call them and get them to do it. Frankly, I didn't care, because if you want one word to explain why punk happened, Queen.
Right.
You know, so,
it was the opposition to Queen. It was the fight against Queen.
That was where I was at, though I was friendly with Roger, and he actually is. This is show busy, but I promise you, he's my great mate. Like, you know, we hang. Harvey Goldsmith, who, as I said, is in the next room, he said, "You got to call Queen." And I said, "I don't want to call Queen." He goes, "Yeah, you got to." I honestly think he just wanted to get their next tour. But I mean, because he had been their promoter and stuff like that. And I said, "Queen, we got so many people. Like, you know, what that?" He says, "No, you got to get them. They're amazing." I said, "Eh." Anyway, so I wasn't that pushed. I was exhausted. I was really sick of calling people and begging. I put the moral arm lock on the Who. Roger hated Pete and vice versa at the time. I had to really ask Pete. I had to write to him to get in contact with Roger and come back together and stuff like that. So I was tired of all this. And I knew that Queen had just finished a world tour. Spike Edney was their MD, the piano player still is. He played trombone with the Rats, with the Boomtown Rats, when we played with the horn section. So I called Spike. Spike said, "I honestly don't think they'll do it, Bob. It hasn't been amazing. Everyone's tired, and I think Fred's going to go off and make a solo album." And that largely is a signal that a band's had it, you know, when the singer goes off. So he said, "Speak to Rog." So Rog came on and said exactly the same thing. He said, "Speak to Jim Beach." So I called Jim, who's a hardcore manager, but actually quite a good bloke. And he just said, "Oh, like, you know, it's great what you're doing. We know all about it, but it's not really our thing." Yeah, too right. It's not. They're the only band who broke the cultural boycott and played in South Africa, for example. You know? But that's their thing, you know. Like, if they want it, I'm not going to, you know. So... Anyway, he said, "It's up to Fred, and we're tired and that." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll ask that." A couple of days later, phone calls, "Bobsy." I said, "Hi, Fred." And he said,
sweet.
"So what's all this about, darling?" And I said, "Well, you know," or he said, "Oh, it's wonderful. It's just not really our thing, is it?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. It's everybody's thing, isn't it?" So it ended up with me not being very persuasive and him trying to argue with me that they shouldn't really do it. And I think something just popped into my head that made him, because I promise you, didn't really care. We had a huge bill now.
You were going to be fine.
Yeah, we were going to be fine. And I said, "Listen, Fred, honestly, if there was ever a stage built for you, this is it." And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, darling, the world." And there was this pause, and he said, "I think I know where you're coming from." And they showed up, but boy, did they get it right, because we were calling it the global jukebox. We wanted the biggest bands doing their biggest songs, not track 4, side 2 of the 5th album, the hits, because it was nothing to do with my choice or Harvey's choice or anyone's choice. It was how many records did you sell? 10 million, you're on. You know, Van Morrison, personal hero, not selling enough, you know, or any of the other bands that, why wasn't so-and-so on? Why was not enough record sales, you know? So if we had hundreds of millions of record sales throughout the day. Hundreds of millions would watch. And that's in effect what happened. And they got it down exactly, quite literally, this astonishing medley of music that had passed me by, frankly, passed many of us by, because it was complex pop. We're using the studio as another instrument. Oh, fuck off.
Yeah, right, right. The opposite of punk, the opposite of what you were trying to do.
EAB, that'll do it, mate.
But when you see, are you like, oh, I get it now, this is...
I was very panicked that this wasn't happening, as the play makes clear. That people were too in love with the whole day, the beauty of the day, youth in excelsis, young bodies, full of health, full of vigour, full of vim. Beautiful day in Philadelphia, beautiful, perfect day in London. Everyone just mad with the whole idea of that everyone in the world, 95% of all television sets on the planet, and this connectedness. And I just thought no one's remembered what this is. So I was running up to the gantries at the top of Wembley Stadium, which are a long way up, and I ran into the BBC studios to say, get a grip, essentially.
Right.
But on the way up, I heard this astonishing sound, whether it was Freddie doing oh, or whether it was, and they were astonishing. And unlike other festivals, we're doing about 14 festivals in the summer. I just arrive, I do my thing, we blow every other band off the stage, and I leave, So that's the thing. But that afternoon, both at Wembley and Philadelphia, everyone hung out. Everyone who was driving the backstage crews mad because there was no space to move. And, I went down after Queen, I'd done my thing on TV, and I saw Bowie and going over to Freddie and, Townsend and all those others just going insane. Yeah. That was insanely good.
We have a clip of you actually during Live Aid. Can we play that?
Two up-and-coming young pop stars, David Bowie and Mick Jagger, in the video dancing in the street, which they made specially for this event.
The other thing is that Mick and David did that video specifically so that you could give something, and it's not happening enough. You've got to get on the phone and take the money out of your pocket. Don't go to the pub tonight, please. Stay in and give us the money. There are people dying now, so give me the money. And here's the numbers. And
let's
read
go
about.
Through the way. I think we're probably going to get the address first, aren't we?
No, let's the address. Let's get the numbers, because that's how we're going to get it.
I see the focus there. You're right. Like, I don't want this to be about the beauty of the music. I don't want this to be about the party that we're having. I don't want us to start patting ourselves on the back for this beautiful moment. We need money. This needs to change.
Yes, exactly.
It's a powerful clip, man.
It did. And much to our dismay, the five of us who do Band Aid, or six of us, the resonance of the concert, even more the resonance of that small track, which the Canadians, of course, contributed to, a Bryan Adams song, Tears Are Not Enough, and, Joni and Gordon Lightfoot and Neil all came to. And
the Northern Lights, yeah.
Yeah, it was huge here. So this thing just snowballed. But the whole point of it is that, as I said to you, we wake up every morning with the reality of that day. But more to the point, 20 years later, this is the 20th anniversary of Live 8, which was far bigger. It was 1,000 bands in 9 concerts simultaneously because technology had changed. And so what that small little record that Christmas in London did was, over 20 years, corral the greatest political and economic powers of the world to do its bidding, which we did at Live 8 at Gleneagles in 2005. So while Live Aid raised in 1985 money $140 million, about that. That's $480 million in today's money. But Live 8, 20 years later, as we worked the lobby that Live 8 gave us, the access and the lobby of its success, we worked that for 20 years, and finally we were able to deliver a cancellation of debt to the poorest countries in the world, rather like getting the mortgage off your neck that you can't pay, and $50 billion a year in aid to the poorest people of the world, which is less than what Europe gets. To put this in context, the richest continent gets more aid than the poorest continent, Africa, which is a disgrace. Of course, we now learned that Donald Trump has suspended all help to the poorest children in the world over the weekend, which is a disgrace that the most powerful country in the world, known for its generosity, has done something so despicable.
What are the feelings that come up when you're here talking about Live Aid and this incredible work you did to try and raise global awareness for the poor, and also just about the debt we have to one another as humans? And then you see this weekend that Elon Musk says that Donald Trump is going to suspend U.S. aid, U.S. international development.
Well, I've articulated many times it's extremely foolish politically. The consequence to America of all this stuff, the tariff nonsense, all this stuff, is he's delusional. Completely accept the democratic mandate. I completely accept that people just feel something has to change. I completely accept that it's possible, but surely without the unkindness, surely without the vulgarity, surely with some grace, surely with some type of empathy that understands that other than your billionaire, multi-billionaire mates who are going to do even more out of this, that money doesn't, the only legitimate power comes through the people, therefore Trump has that. But there is no legitimacy to Musk or Zuckerberg, etc. There's none. And
they weren't democratically elected. They weren't,
No, it's a plutocracy, and it'll fail because of that. Autocracy fails. There is no such thing as a strong man. By definition of being called a strong man, there's the inherent weakness. They will fail.
But what do you think is, as someone who has been part of this for so long, what is behind the suspension of international aid, international development aid?
Well, it's always there. It's always up for query. It doesn't work. The way it's done doesn't work, etc., etc., etc. So the first thing is it does work. It's very simple. Let's take it to its basic. A 2-year-old infant is dying of hunger in a world of surplus. We produce much more food than we actually require. And the anomaly with that is that, let's say, with the Farm Bill in the United States or the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, possibly in Canada, I'm not aware of it, farmers are subsidised to grow food. This is all post-war, Second World War stuff, and we see those institutions are now being taken apart, probably because there's a new economic compact. It requires a new politics. I don't mind that. I don't mind it being taken apart and looked at and said intellectually we have to change and find newer ways of organising the world. It's true. Okay, but there are ways and ways. We don't need barbarism. But what is still true in a very just simple sense, we can take the food that we subsidise. We still subsidise wheat in Europe. We pay taxes to pay for it to grow. We don't need it, so we pay further taxes to store it. And most disgracefully, we then pay more taxes to burn it. While 8 miles south of our continent, 8 miles, Africa's 8 miles from Europe, 8 miles, that's it. People die of starvation. For example, right now in Sudan is half the size of the United States. 25 million people are undergoing enforced famine. Now, powers that be don't want to use the word famine because they panic and things get weird. But yes, because of the wars there. So anyone, if you're black in eastern or western Sudan, then you're slaughtered. Mass gang rape and Band-Aid are there on the borders if these panicked if these panicked people make it over the line, then us and many, many others are there to help. This should not be the way the world functions, but it is the way we behave. And as such, there are ways to mitigate that. Foreign aid in America is something like 0.001% of the US budget. I mean, it is literally an accounting error, but because the US economy is so huge, of course it's billions. Africa is still the poorest continent. There's 750 million extremely poor people in the world, half of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. There are 600 million people suffering from hunger this evening. Half of them, 300 million, are people in sub-Saharan Africa who will go to bed again cold and hungry tonight. That need not be. And I don't understand why it should be. But more to the point, I cannot understand why you would snatch away the food from that cold and hungry child whose mother has just been gang raped, who has staggered over a line to safety, where are there people there to say, no, tonight you go to bed a little safer, a little warmer, and your kid ain't going to die. And his dad is going to be given the tools and the equipment so they can grow something next year. Why wouldn't you? Why would you take it away? It does work.
It works. Why would you take it away? If I can hear people speaking back to the radio right now, it brings to mind another thing I wanted to talk to you about with this musical is I have never seen a play that is critical of its subject. Like the voices that might be listening to the radio right now that are critical of Live Aid, that are critical of Band Aid for a bunch of reasons, for white saviorism, for the lack of African acts, for whether it did any good. I'm not bringing this up. I'm bringing this up because this is brought up in the play. The criticism of Live Aid and Band Aid is in the play. Was that a note from you? Was that something important for you to have in there?
The argument changes as time goes on, as society changes, as economies change, as the politics change. So new arguments come to the fore. What people can't accept is the simplicity of Band Aid and Live Aid. Give us some money and we'll keep people going. It's really simple. So what's the argument? Things like progressive, in inverted commas, new ideas are largely, abstract when you're dealing with the distended stomachs and the soundless agony of death by starvation. When you hold a 3-year-old and the only thing the mother could give it is unleavened grain, unbaked grain, and so the child voids its life through your fingers. Arguments about that sort of thing are totally abstract to me.
So why was I mean this, was that important for you to have those conversations in the play? Because they're had in the play. Like that argument is made in the play.
Yeah, and I mean, the character Bob rebuts them with exactly what I've just said. I don't have time for it, Also, they're non-arguments. I mean, look, if you want to get into the economics of Africa, I'm more than willing. Up to about 2 years ago, I was the largest private sector employer in the country of Ghana. So if you want to get into investment and stuff like that, no, it's all about, I can do that till you're blue in the face. And Tom, you would have the most boring program on CBC. So if you want to get onto an economy thing, we'll do that. I'm here to tell you, I've done this for 40 years. I've travelled the continent backwards. I've done endless documentaries about the culture and the dynamism and the language and the politics and the governance and the this, that and the other. It's odd. It sounds like I'm up my own ass saying this. I'm an expert. Literally I consult with governments and stuff like that. It's weird. I'm much more interested in the Boomtown Rats upcoming tour in the UK, much more interested. I'm more interested in the double album we've coming out in March and then the single album we've coming out. Much more. That's all I want to bloody talk about. But if you want to talk about nonsense like white saviorism and absolute nonsense like that, it's funny now, but it's just irritating when it gets in the way of trying to help others.
Here's what I want to talk about is media. Yeah. And I recognize that we're in the home of Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan,
absolutely.
the greatest media scholar ever to live.
Yeah.
I tell you what I was struck by last night was that I was born in 87. So I was born, this is not, I wasn't around for Live Aid at all, right?
You look older.
Thank you very much. Yeah. It's been a hard life of folk music. It's been I do feel older. There was a lingua franca.
Yeah.
Everybody around the world was generally listening to the same records.
Yeah.
They had big stars who were generally selling a lot of records because there were only a few radio stations to listen to. So everybody had a common attention on those radio stations. Yeah. There were only a few TV channels that everyone could beam into. You were able to have what we call a monoculture. I think that former U.S. President Barack Obama's talked about this, one of the greatest threats to our world right now, perhaps not on the more intellectually than anything else, is the idea that we have a fragmented culture right now. If I have 200 people in a room, there's 200 people not watching the same thing. They might be watching different YouTube videos. They might be watching different channels. They might not have the same media, music, cultural diet. When the world is not looking at one thing, can we have moments like Live Aid again?
No.
So what does that make you think about?
Ultimately, what we wanted, why we agreed to allow this to go ahead, and all of this year, I mean, we'll take a view on what happens to the Band-Aid Trust after this year, but largely we wanted to leave behind a newer generation, which I think the play deals with, that this is what we did. It was viable then, it was possible then. There are new ways of doing this, but we're just too old or not interested enough to find out what they are. Something will happen where there will be something that unifies the thought process, that people will say, no, enough.
You really believe so?
I do think that there'll be, some terror, some horror. If we see something that's a prurient horror on television, if we see something like, let's say, the fires in Los Angeles, we sympathize and we see nature that, rampant and beyond our control. So we worry when things go beyond our control. That tends to unify the human corpus, if you like. There will be ways of doing it. The fragmented nature of the internet just goes to the fragmented natures of our own cultures and thoughts anyway. So it isn't as if there was a monoculture. There was a mono agreement on certain types of music, but by Live 8 we had understood that. But it's still unified around the central idea of no. No is a very powerful word. I had to think about this because when I was a kid, I shared a bedroom with my dad, and he had a double bed on one side of the room and I had a single bed, and he was away for most of the week. My mum was dead. He was away on Monday to Friday selling shit. And behind my bed was just a giant poster, and it was a stark black and white of a nuclear bomb, a nuclear explosion, with just the word no written underneath it. And
Right.
I've now come to realise that that's the founding philosophy of the rest of my life. No.
No.
It comes out as fuck off, mostly, but no is basically it.
I saw the musical. I remember that. Before we go, can you tell the story about the CBC story about how the CBC factors into the...
There's a lot of stuff that Canada needs to get a big up for, but I think it comes home to roost. I was very aware of what CBC were reporting when, at the end of each day in the record company allowed me to work out of their office. I'd go down to the second floor to the A&R thing, which is the talent scout people, and I'd go from each room, and each national TV station would have set up their cameras and report. The French would say, what's happening, we're all ready to go, etc., etc. I got to CBC. And they said, Bob, we've made this film for you. We'd like you to show it. I said, guys, I don't have time, honestly. I said, what do you want to ask? I said, no, really, it's come direct from Addis. And I said, I honestly, don't. Germany's next, got to do it, got to get back on the phones. They said, okay, well, keep it, will you, and have a look. And I said, yeah. I was, tired and fed up and bored by this stage. So I went upstairs and was on the phone to people, and while I was waiting or just not listening to someone, I slipped it on the video, and what I saw was astonishing, cruel, heartbreaking. It was the pornography of poverty. That's exactly what it was. It was obscene what was being done to fellow human beings. It is academic to me that it's Africa. It doesn't matter to me if they're black, green, orange or lime pink, whether you're Martian or from France. If what happened in 1984-5 happened in France or Yorkshire or Northern Ontario, I would do the exact same thing. It doesn't matter. So what I saw were human beings, the sump of human degradation imposed on these people because there's no need for it. So I was horrified by this, and it was only after the first images had trolled by that I realised what I was watching. So apparently Brian Stewart had been up to northern Ethiopia where all this was happening, and still is largely.
A CBC reporter, Brian Stewart.
Yeah. And he'd come back to Addis with his cameraman, and the cameraman was piecing together the bits CBC just simply couldn't show. And fair play, you couldn't. I mean, it was awful. And the whiz-bang technology at the time was a Walkman. Do you remember Walkmans? You were born after the Walkman.
I remember. I saw it in a museum the other day.
Your parents shut you up by putting these tiny things on your infant ears. Shut up,
I saw it on Wikipedia the other day. For some, it was under ancient times, I believe. Yeah.
So he was listening to his Walkman, and he was playing the go-to hit at the time, The Cars. Who's Going to Drive You Home? This guy was cutting the bits they could never show on television, and he was just piecing them together for the archives. And he suddenly realised that he was putting this film together to The Cars, to Who's Going to Drive You Home Tonight. And this is why Live Aid worked, because the power of this minor art form, pop music, is so compelling in its meanings. Beyond the simple boy-girl stuff. So who's going to pick you up when you fall down? He's talking about, a breakup song. Who's going to drive you home? Who's going to drive you home tonight? Took on whole other resonances. And so I had to go and meet Harvey Goldsmith, who is the promoter and producer of the show, with David Bowie, because David wanted to go through what songs he was going to do. So I took the film and ran over to Harvey's place. He was up the road on Oxford Street. And it was about 11 at night. And I went in, and David and Harvey were chatting. And I went in and said, so what are we going to do? And I said, before we start, guys, look at this, what I've just got. And we put on the CBC thing. And Bowie sat there and started to cry. Not sobbing, just tears. And he just said, however many songs I'm doing, I'm giving up one and I'm introducing this. And I just said, you can't, for loads of reasons. And Harvey said they won't show it. The BBC will just take it off the international feeds and we've got silence. We just can't do it, And he said, I don't care. He said, I'm not playing if I can't do it. And David had been very involved since the beginning with Band Aid. He introduced it on television. He introduced the video, etc. And what people think about David Bowie is this sort of austere, distant, artist.
Yeah.
But he was a very, very good bloke, a nice man. And so he said, how many songs? And we said, well, you're David Bowie. Maybe, chancing my arm, 5 songs. Everyone's got 15 minutes. What about 20? And he said, I'll do 4. What do you want me to do? And he said, obviously Heroes, which is where we get the title for the play, Just for One Day, We Can Be Heroes. And Harvey and I just looked at each other. What do you do? What do you argue with David Bowie? He's not going to do the show. Of course, he's got to do the show. So come the moment. The Queen movie has it that, I haven't seen it, but what I hear is that, Queen do their piece and the world goes crazy and the phone lines collapse. That's not true. The whole world loved their set, they won the day, if you like. But what really happened was that David came on. He was really nervous. He was trembling. Trembling at the side of the stage. Well, that was weird. And he goes on and he kills it. And he does Heroes, and then the place is going nuts, and he sort of interrupts them impatiently, and he says, thank you very much, I want you to look at this. And he just points to the screen. And it is the most staggering thing. If you go on the Live Aid YouTube channel and watch it, here's the youth of Britain, the youth of America and Philadelphia, the youth of the world, at the height of their beauty, at the peak of their health. Beautiful girls on beautiful boys' shoulders, their tops off on this blistering blue sky day. And they're smiling and just so in love with that moment. And Bowie, and they look up at the screens in full expectation because David has told them. And it's fascinating. You watch their faces crumple. And the girls have got their tops off. And even though they've got bras on, you can see them cover themselves up as if they've been suddenly exposed to something that they can't quite understand. And they kind of struggle to get off their boyfriend's shoulders. And the guys are holding them, they're holding their legs, and they're just staring, transfixed by what they're watching. And, the girls are trying to get down. And that's the moment where the phone lines melt. I mean, literally in some places, phone lines collapsed. Old ladies went into Ireland, into the Irish producers, RTE, the Irish CBC. I got a phone call, and the Irish producer said, "Bob, there's 5 ladies here who want to give us their wedding rings." And I said, "What age are they?" And they said, he said, they're quite old. So I said, I thought for a minute, and I said, take the rings, take their names and addresses and phone number, tell them to wait a week. They can collect their rings in the week. If they haven't gone back to collect them in a week, sell them.
How about that?
The place went crazy. A couple rang up. They just bought their new house. They sold their house. I said, stop it. Take your house back. Go and live there. Be happy.
It's a beautiful thing that CBC reporter had that part of it. It's a beautiful story. Man, I could talk to you about this forever, but thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Tom.